Hi, I'm Jo Ruddock, and I'm here with John Mailhot, CTO Networking and Infrastructure at Imagine Communications. Hi, John. Good to have you here.
Hi, glad to be here.
So let's talk about how UHD and HDR are key to today's sports production environments.
Yes, UHD and HDR, they're really quite transformative. Now, everything in sports production is sort of driven by the rights holder and the rights holder's requirements. And what we're seeing is a little bit different in different parts of the world, but certainly in Europe, many of the rights holders now are interested in having UHD production and by extension HDR because they've worked out ways to deliver it to their consumers. Sky Sport is a great example of a rights holder who's now doing UHD and HDR production for some of their premier events, and it really all is of course driven by the rights holder. But once you have that requirement, it drives everything about the design. You have to have now OB trucks that are capable of UHD. You have to have infrastructure for delivering from the truck to the network hub that's capable of UHD and so forth. So it really, once the rights holders start to have this requirement, it drives the entire technology chain all the way back through eventually consumer delivery. On the OB side, of course, to produce UHD with HDR has a fascinating set of requirements because from an economic standpoint, you want to have one production. You want to have one set of cameras, one set of replay, one set of production switcher operators, vision mixer operators, if you will. And then at the back end, make both this nice, new, beautiful UHD, HDR production, but also an HD standard dynamic range production that's delivered to the rest of the consumers, which is most of them. Because after all, that's where the advertising dollars are, is on the rest of the consumers. And this single path workflow to achieve both the HDR production that looks super beautiful and drives HDR and UHD viewers, but simultaneously generating the standard dynamic range production for the bulk of today's viewers is kind of the challenge in sport. And it ripples into everything. It ripples into graphics, it ripples into camera shading. At each point in the production, especially in camera shading, you need that check of how is this going to look in SDR. Otherwise, you could produce an event that looks beautiful in HDR, but maybe doesn't look as good as people expect in the old way. And that's just not acceptable. So the requirement to produce the event in HDR and in UHD actually is a significant driver all the way through. On the equipment side, especially, HDR conversion is a combination of two things. There's a standards-based element that just says, there's an ITU standard and you follow it. But there's also an artistic element of, no, I want to shade it a little differently. I want to have the highlights map a certain way. And this combination of artistic judgment and standards-based conversion is something that, I'd imagine we've spent a lot of focused effort on. It ripples into all of our products. So our Selenium network processor, for example, is used by many broadcasters to do these kinds of conversions where we can take, say, a prescribed LUT that's developed particularly for a production or a production workflow, but then also allow a certain amount of adjustment per production on top of that. In other cases, we'll implement exactly the standard conversion, but then allow the camera shader to go adjust exactly the red gain or the blue gain or something in the middle so that they get the standards-based conversion plus a very production-specific tweak. So there's all manner of this, especially when taking standard dynamic range assets in a production, maybe replay footage from prior events or B-roll or so forth, and then pulling it into the HDR production. That upmapping is a case where people frequently implement some artistic intent and then, of course, have to check how does it come back down. So all in all, the implementation of UHD and HDR into the production workflow has to be really seriously considered to meet both the economic requirements of a single production that generates both the traditional and the HDR version, and also meets all of the artistic needs to have a first-class production.
That's great. Thank you very much, John. Thank you for your time today.
Oh, glad to be here.